Welcome back. In this step, let's review the code that is set up for the JWT framework. We saw that there were a number of resources that are being exposed. When you do a post to /authenticate, the expected request was with a username and password, and we got a response with the token, with the JWT token value. This usually is a very big value. When we wanted to refresh, what we would need to do? We would need to send a GET request to this refresh URL. That would help us in refreshing the token. The additional thing that you need to send along with the GET request is a authorization header, bearer, and the JWT token. And for all the other kind of requests, let's say I want to request a resource, I would want to execute a GET request or a post or a put or a delete. What we would need to do? We would need to send a header with the JWT token. We would need to send an authorization header with bearer space the JWT token. This is what we saw in the previous step. One of the important things to understand is JWT tokens are very complex to handle. Like if you see this one, it's so huge, right? This is one of the tokens which we used in our own application, and this is huge. And that's the reason why for doing all the token processing, we have a file called JWT token util.java. This helps us in creating the tokens. It helps us in getting details out of the token. You would want to find out what is the username, what are the roles that are allowed for a specific users, what are the permissions that he has. So there are different claims, and the JWT token util helps you to get details from a token, as well as it helps you to create a token when needed. It also takes care of all the expiration date and that kind of stuff. So you need to calculate, when I'm creating a token, okay, what should be the expiration date? When I get a token, what is the expiration date on it? And is it past the expiration date? So all that kind of logic is built into the JWT token util. This is the file, and you'd see that there are a number of methods which are present in here to get username, get expiration date, is token expired, generate a token, and refresh a token, to validate a token whether it's valid or not. So all that kind of stuff is done inside the JWT token util. You'd see that JWT token util class is extensively used across the JWT framework. The interesting thing is the JWT token util makes use of the JWTs class extensively. This is from the library that we had imported. So if I do a sync, you'd see that this is coming from the JWT jar which we added into our pond.xml. Now the next ones are the resources themselves. You want to expose these two URLs. The input for this or the request for this is this username and password, and the response is token. So this is like any RESTful service that you would want to create. So localhost 8080/authenticate. What would we typically do? You would create a resource for it, right? Same thing with /refresh. The input for this is the token, and the output again is a new token value. I have not really put the response in here, but the refresh token would also return a response containing the token. How are these resources implemented? There are 4 important files with the code for these resources. The JWT token request and response represent this request and this response. So you would see that token request has the username and password, and token response has the token. As simple as that. And you'd see that the authentication REST controller contains the important methods to be able to handle our resources. So we want a refresh and a create authentication token. So you'd see the request mappings for them. You can see that these are being picked up from the property file. So if you look at application.properties, that's where these URLs are coming from, /authenticate/refresh. The authenticate request, what it does is it first uses Spring Security to check if the username and password is right. If the username and password is right, then we go ahead, load the user details, create the token, and return it back. Now what does refresh do? Refresh first checks if the token is valid, if everything is fine, then it gets the user details and it checks the expiration date, and if it's all matching, then it would create the token and return it back. Whenever there is an exception, we have a specific exception for authentication which is present in here, which will be thrown. So these are the important files which are corresponding to the implementation of the get token and the refresh token resources. Let's consider all the other requests. What should we do? Whenever you send any request, a get, a post, a put, or a delete to any of the resources, what do we want to do? We would want to check if there is a right token on it, whether there is an authorization header with the bearer token containing the JWT, and if the JWT token is valid. Think of your web application experience. How do we implement such kind of requirements? I want to do something for every request. What do? Is we use something called a filter. So what we do is we implement something called a token authorization once per request filter. So for every request, we would want to authorize the JWT token, and that's what this specific filter helps us to do. All that this filter would do is check if the user is valid, if the user is, the user JWT token is valid. If the token is valid, it would load the user details and it would set it into the security context holder.get context. This is one of the places which is most important. So once a user is authenticated and authorized, you put his details into the security context holder.get context, so that all the other servlets, all the other resources, controllers would be able to access the user details as they would be needing them. Now, let's say your user details, that's the user ID, password, what are the roles of the user, are stored in a database, or they are stored in a LDAP, or they are stored in memory. What Spring Security says is, I don't really want to worry about where your user details are stored in. What you need to do is, I'll give you an interface. You implement the interface and make sure that you provide the right implementation. I'll tell you what is the signature and what should be the return value. You implement it, provide it to me, and I'll take care of using these user details to authenticate the user. So our role ends with providing the user details. What is that service? That service is the user details service. This is an interface which is defined inside the Spring Security Core framework. And what we are doing with the in-memory user details service is implementing the user details service. The important method in the user details service is load user by username. So given a username, all that you need to do is to provide an implementation of this interface user details. The implementation of the user details that we have created is the JWT user details. So what do we do over here in this specific user details service is, when Spring Security gives us a username, we find the details of that user from the static list and return it back in the format of JWT user details. So we just adhere to the contract which is provided by Spring Security. We implement the user details service and return the user details back. What happens is, Spring Security would start using this everywhere. Whenever Spring Security wants to find out the details of a user, let's say I would want to authenticate if the user's password is right. What Spring Security does is, it would first give us the username, ask for the details. And once we provide the right details, Spring Security would take care of validating the password and all that kind of stuff. Now, the last part is actually to bring it all together. There are a wide variety of stuff that we are configuring, right? We are saying we want to configure our own custom user details service which has in-memory details. And in addition to that, we use something called a password encoder. We are not going to store the password as it is. We would want to encode it and store it. And that's why we use a bcrypt password encoder. Next, we want statelessness. We don't want a session created for us in the application. We are creating a REST API. We don't want to have any session on the server. The next thing is something called authentication entry point. Authentication entry point is all about handling unauthenticated users. A guy is trying to come into the application, is unauthenticated. What should be the response that we send back? In the case of a web application, the authentication entry point, you would want to configure a form, a login page. In the case of a REST API, or in the case of a JWT authenticated REST API, what we would need to do is, we would send an error response. We would send a response saying your request does not have a JWT token. And that's what is implemented as part of the JWT unauthorized response authentication entry point. That's one of the classes which is present in here. And you would see that it would just send an unauthorized response with these details. So we need to configure that. The other thing we would need to configure is the filter which we have created. We had created a filter but we have not really tied it up with the Spring Security framework. The last thing is, at the end of the course, we would be using something called H2 console. So H2 is an in-memory database, and we would be using H2 console to look at the data in the database. So we do want to make sure that this URL is not secure. What we do is we implement all this inside the JWT web security config. There is a default configuration which is already provided by Spring Security, Web Security Configure Adapter. We extended this even when we were implementing basic authentication, and we extend that for JWT as well. So if you look at the important part, this is where the in-memory user detail service is configured, and we are saying it should use the bcrypt password encoder. The next important piece of code is this. We are saying authentication entry point is this. So whenever a user is unauthorized, just send him an error response. You are not authorized. We would want to create a stateless application. The next piece is where we are configuring in the filter. Every request should go through the JWT authentication token filter. In this long video, we went over the JWT framework, or the JWT framework that was set up for us. One of the important things is everything that you are seeing is just one-time setup. For the most part, you would not need to modify any of these files. So it's sufficient if you have a high-level overview of what's happening. You don't really need to understand every detail of what's happening in here. We looked at how the different resources that are related to JWT are implemented, the retrieve token request or the get token request, and the refresh token request. And we saw how we are filtering every request to make sure that every request is authenticated. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye-bye.